Morning. Hello, Professor Marjorie Luesebrink. It's really an honor for us to have you here on our platform at Jamia Millia. So let me introduce Professor Marjorie. Professor Marjorie Coverley Luesebrink is the Professor Emeritus at the School of Humanities and Languages, Irvine Valley College, USA. She's a very well-known writer because she has been writing what is known as digitally born fiction since 1995. She's hypermedia fiction writer. Her full-length interactive electronic novel, Califia, is available on CD-ROM from Eastgate Systems, which was published in 2000. Her hypermedia novel, Egypt, The Book of Going Forth by Day, was published as an artist's book in an electronic form in 2006. A selection of web hypermedia short stories, Fingerprints on Digital Glass, is available on her website. So I would invite everyone to visit her website and read her works. Coverley's current work in progress include Tin Town and Other Excel Fictions, a series of narratives constructed with spreadsheets. Tarim Tapestry and Hours of the Night, which is a PowerPoint poem with Stephanie Stickland. Her web short stories, poems, essays have appeared in all leading journals. And I'm not going to read this very long list. She has also produced an online and real-time collaborative drama, which was titled M is for Nottingham for 2002, a Trace Incubation Convention. Trace is something that Siddhartha was talking about yesterday. She has read, exhibited nationally and internationally at Library of Congress, Hammer Museum, Guggenheim Museum, the Digital Center for Arts at UCLA, Brown University, Museum of Post-Digital Cultures, and many other significant spaces. Because the field of electronic literature is still emerging, many practitioners have participated in several elements of field building, and Professor Luesebrink is a leading name in that field. She is a founding board member and past president of Electronic Literature Organization, which is very popular. Some of our students recently have won research fellowship in Electronic Literature Organization. She has written non-fiction and critical articles about e-literature and has curated several online collection of works. She has been the editor of the Blue Moon Review, Inflect, Riding the Meridian, and Word Circuits. It's really a pleasure for us to have you, Professor Marjorie. We are so happy to have you, and we are very keen to listen to you. I will not take much of your time, and I will invite you to present your thoughts on electronic literature, because you have not only theorized and talked from distance about this, but you have actually practiced it and shown us what it is. So over to you, Professor Marjorie Luesebrink.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Zaidi. That was a lovely introduction. And I'm almost looking around to see who that might be, because it was just so complete. And I am so glad to be here and want to congratulate all of you on the initiation of an electronic literature component to your Department of English program. My original idea for what I was going to say was that I was going to talk about ongoing innovation with an eye to the title of your conference. But as I began to think more about it, I was so impressed with the scope and the seriousness and the really truly wide thinking going on amongst your students and panelists and professors that I narrowed this down to an idea which would be 10 things that I believe will be part of the creativity bonus for your department, your college, your university and community, your professors, students, and even readers, as a component of having an electronic literature program at your school. So I will proceed to that. But again, thank you for the lovely introduction. Thank you for having me here today. It's not that warm in California either, but we're looking forward to spring. Let me just do one thing. I'll start with a little bit of rather anecdotal information about this long history which you have outlined, since I know that many people will find it interesting to note that all of us started out and still continue to be reinventing electronic literature as we go along. So I got my first computer, if you would believe this, in 1981. It had 256K, which most of you have keychains with more memory than that now. In fact, you have light bulbs with more memory than that. And what astounded me right at the very beginning, and I'm sure for most of you who have been involved even for a few years with electronic literature, was the amazing possibilities that this practice allowed writers of fiction, nonfiction, poetry, short fiction, flash fiction, the affordances allowed by this practice in expanding our narrative abilities. And by that, I mean, when we look at literature, we look at a practice that is intended to bring us closer to the way real life is, or real life could be imagined, or imaginary life can be realized. And all of the practices of the past have worked toward developing a way to communicate our imaginative and real experiences to each other. And so I was so amazed at what seemed to be possible in 1981. And of course, I wasn't alone. There were plenty of people out there who began to experiment with possibilities. That ran all the way from one of our earliest practitioners, Judy Malloy, who was writing in a very early social media chat group called The Well, and developing a narrative called Uncle Roger in that format, to Dina Larson, who was working with HyperCard, to Michael Joyce, who was working in Story Space, Shelley Jackson in Story Space, Stephanie Strickland working in Story Space and stretching Story Space with works like True North. And then there were also people working in other related fields, such as interactive fiction and early gaming practices. And all of these were more or less not aware of each other in that sense for several years, from let's say 1981 to the early 1990s. But I think of as a kind of moving point of discovery in the early 1990s, 1993, 94, 95. And in 1995, Professor Catherine Hales, whom many of you are familiar with, had a seminar at UCLA called Literatures in Transition. And it took up the issues of electronic literature and what was developing at that time. And she more or less brought together the community, both the community from Brown, Jay Bolter and Mark Bernstein, who were and Michael Joyce, who were developing Story Space, other communities from the West Coast and across the country into a larger community that was aware of each other. But what is really interesting about this for all of us is that even at that moment in 1995, electronic literature was already global. That is, if we look at many literature practices, they start local, they may stay local for a very long time, sometimes forever, or they will in fact become international in scope, something like surrealism. But electronic literature was global from the very beginning. Right as soon as we began to find each other doing this early work, there was already work going on in Russia, in Japan, in Brazil, in Portugal, in Canada, as well as the United States, France, the Netherlands, in Scandinavian countries. It was amazing how consolidated, in a sense, that is, how our thinking converged so quickly across the globe in this particular endeavor in this new genre. So that was very exciting. And I would like to say right now that the excitement I felt in 1995, I still feel today in 2023. And I especially feel it when new programs come online, new people from countries that haven't yet participated or have been participating and are moving in really into high gear are participating. I still feel that same sense of surprise and optimism and delight at the global nature that is built into the electronic literature community. And I'm going to talk more about why that's possible in a little while. In any case, by 1995, people began to find each other. By 2000, there were a few, Trace was one of them, which was mentioned, digital arts and culture, and at that time, the Electronic Literature Organization began to take shape in the imagination and pretty soon take shape in reality. And that, of course, expanded our ability to be able to embrace people who were essentially doing electronic literature, but hadn't thought of themselves as doing digital born work or knew about a larger community working in this field. We hoped at the time in 2000 that there would be more commercial possibilities for electronic literature. But some of us weren't really that unhappy about the fact that it wasn't commercially immediately successful, because if you had been writing and publishing, as I had, in short narratives in the years before the electronic literature possibilities arose, you would have been publishing anyway in small literary magazines in which you got paid 3 copies or you got paid in copies anyway. So it was experimental literature in any country has never been something that's like commercially lucrative on which we all could retire and live comfortably in an island that we could buy or something. So we moved into 2000. There was a big change, of course, in the nature of the platforms that were available, because by 2000, we now had a growing World Wide Web, and we had a new social media and a huge gaming community, all of them coming into widespread use across the United States at that time, and really across many countries. So the Electronic Literature Organization was formed. And that's now history. You had Leonardo Flores was a speaker yesterday for you. And I believe that Astrid Enslin is going to help recap the conference at the end of today. And of course, many of you have been interacting with ELO people and activities now for some time, and that's just a great pleasure. So ELO gets formed, and the next thing I wanted to point out in terms of the evolution, because it's going to be part of a later discussion, is the as soon as we got formed into ELO, the first conference we had was at UCLA in California, and Kate Hales brought up the issue of obsolescence. It was huge, and there was an explosion of people both saying, yes, we need to do something about preservation, and also another huge group of people who said, oh no, we don't need to do anything about it because art is ephemeral and so forth. But in any case, it was a landmark period, because the electronic literature people, the digital arts people, were among the first across the entire electronic communications world to come up hard against the fact that the rapidly changing hardware, software, platform universe was a threat to the preservation of the works that had come before. In fact, I finished Califia, which you had mentioned, in 2000. It was published in 2000. By 2010, Califia could not at that point be played on any current machine that most people had. The software had already expired, been bought by 3 other companies, and was not backward compatible. The kinds of machines that ran those resolutions were way out of date 10 years later, and you could not, in fact, run it at all. What's interesting about that, and I'm going to talk a little bit about it later, is that as a community, what we found very quickly was something that other communities, library communities, research communities, plastic art communities, drama communities were going to find out very shortly, within the next 10 or 15 years, but hadn't come up to, because they weren't as actively trying to present and circulate the work that they were storing electronically. So the idea of how we're going to get back to it hadn't yet occurred to the rest of the electronic communications world, but now, of course, is a recognized issue and a recognized challenge everywhere. So at that point, we moved into the 21st century, and my goodness, it's almost incredible to think of the expanding possibilities, the ways in which electronic literature has grown. For my own part, what I ended up doing was teaching myself a series of softwares, hardwares, various platforms over time in order to keep on working in electronic literature. I started Califia in a program called Toolbook, and I stuck with that all the way through. But I started Egypt on the web in HTML, and then I moved it to Director finally. But in between, I had done a Toolbook version, another DHTML version, and then finally and then finally a director version. And then I did a lot of work that was just HTML and DHTML. And of course, the browsers changed so fast that, as you had mentioned in the later works, I experimented with Stephanie Strickland in doing a PowerPoint piece, because PowerPoint seems stable and people seem to be able to use it year after year. It turned out it wasn't very portable. I tried a piece in the Tin Towns, which I'm still working on, is in Excel. My most recent work actually has been in video, using handheld phone camera for the video, and using mostly off-the-shelf preparation software such as Roxio, and very, very primitive photo editing things that are mostly free, because they kind of stay around and they're easy to use and easy to handle. So so I've gone probably through at least 10 different softwares and as many platforms over the time that I've been writing electronic literature. It would have been very nice, I think, to have stayed with Toolbook and have worked in one particular software over the last 25 or 30 years. However, that certainly is not the nature of electronic literature. I'd like to leave some time. I'd like to leave some time for questions and to interact with the audience, even though we're a long distance away. It feels so comfortable to be with all of you, because of course we're all part of the same community of electronic practitioners and scholars and teachers, and we have so much in common that way, because the thinking behind doing electronic digital work is a particular kind of approach to multiplicity, to seeing things in many different perspectives at the same time, and to being open to possibility and change. So I would like to move ahead and save some time for questions. So here are the 10 things that will enrich your program at your university, your professors, your students, your teachers, your readers, and the entire community of academics that you interact with. So the first thing that keeps electronic literature always enriching, always growing in creativity, is the fact that it continues to be global. It was global from the very beginning, and it continues to expand globally. We at one ELO conference, for example, we had people from 22 countries. So we have groups of people working in India. We have people working, well, I probably won't get all of the places, but of course, Japan, Russia, Norway, Sweden, France, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Argentina, Brazil, Peru, Mexico, Canada, the US, England, Scotland, Ireland, well, all over the world. And what makes this global communication possible is very interesting. What makes it not only possible, but almost inevitable. And that is the second point that I'd like to come to, and that is electronic literature keeps growing and enriching in creativity, because it is a practice that combines the uses of language, culture, and artistic practice in ways that other forms of literature can't do. That has to do with the fact that there's image, there's sound, there's structure, there's language always, but there's also the possibility of language being elided and backgrounded by many more universal kinds of artistic communication affordances, strategies, materialities. I'm thinking, for example, of one of the early poetic practices, one of the early poetic authors, Ana Maria Uribe from Brazil. And she did a series of early works, which actually are still available, and you can see them, I think, at the next, which I'll come back to, in which she has letters that stretch, animate, recombine, and dance around to sound. And that it happens to be in Portuguese, but in fact, it's universal. And it's universal for those reasons of the image, the sound, the complexity of a multiplicity of sensory inputs at the same time. So we have the idea that language and translation and culture are easily moved from one country to another, from one culture to another in electronic literature, for all of these reasons of the complexity of the sensory and linguistic affordabilities. The third thing about creativity and the growth of a program like this is the issue of social change. Social change is one of those things that is two-sided. We tend to think that electronic communication or new communications or the World Wide Web or computers change us. But my experience in this field has been that we change ourselves by our usage of these devices as well. And electronic literature is one of those areas where social change derives out of the practice of electronic literature. I've noticed, for example, in many of the presentations in this conference, where we are seeing attention paid to things like Instagram poetry and flash fiction in Facebook and so forth. Now, these kinds of practices where artists and practitioners bring their ideas about literature, about communication, about life, about philosophy, about how it is we exist as humans, to the social media spaces and develop those, are actually social change in action at all times. For example, when you see from the very beginning, Judy Malloy's Uncle Roger, which was written on The Well, was a critique actually of Silicon Valley and what was going on. And even now, as we see in things like fan fiction, which I know has also been covered in this conference, in areas like flash poetry that's being done on, let's say, Instagram or any one of the really interesting social media formats out there now, the artists and scholars that bring their ideas to the social media space make change in the social fabric. And that's an incredibly powerful thing to be able to do. And it's possible through electronic literature. The fourth thing that I think is really important about your new program is that studying electronic literature, both the fiction, the nonfiction, and the poetry, enhances our understanding of the shape of knowledge. Knowledge has actually changed its access since I started out in, let's say, 1965, when I graduated from college. How you got information, what you could do with the information, how you could see it stored, how you in fact understood the way that knowledge and information was architecturally built, and how it could be in fact mined or enclosed or transposed. All of these things are part and parcel of understanding how electronic creation is built. And of course, it's a tremendous thing for everyone who's studying electronic literature to be able to come to it and then see that you understand much better a whole world of information out there that's sitting out in the great global web, that it has its own set of rules. And you learn those rules actually by studying the electronic literature that we have and that we're making now. Number 5 is that we have, as I mentioned before, the electronic literature community, all of us, you guys too, and across the globe, is interested in how we're going to preserve, archive, and disseminate the electronic literature that we have and that we're making. And I think that, of course, you are already participating and are welcome to continue to join in with many of the activities that are underway right now to do this kind of thing. I see that Dini Gregar is with us here today, and she initiated and developed the Next, which is, in my opinion, one of the most visionary, forward-thinking ways of dealing with the issue of preservation, archiving, and dissemination, as the Next is an online both gallery, archive, library, presentation space, and ongoing study center for all of electronic literature. And what's interesting about the Next, of course, is that the Next people, Dini as a leader and her crew, have not tried to make a canon of electronic literature. Thank you. Rather, they have decided to accept all of the donations, which is huge. And maybe she can talk a little bit about this in a couple of minutes. So number 6 is the fact that electronic literature is a natural outcome of print literature in terms of the natural growth of communication technology in our world today. Number 7 is that electronic literature, as you will be embracing it fully in your new program, is always reinventing itself, which makes it continually exciting for scholars and students and practitioners. As the new things come up, we can do cave work, we can do artificial intelligence, we can do virtual reality. We also have the speedy things like Twitter and Instagram. The possibilities are endless. And number 8, the enrichment of your program will always be enhanced by the fact that electronic literature is endlessly beautiful and challenging. So I'm wishing you all success in your program ahead, and I look very much forward to following everything that you do and seeing what your scholars and your students are up to and what kind of work that they're creating. So thank you very much for this opportunity to share with you in the celebration of a new program.
Thank you so much, Professor Luesebrink, for this very interesting and
Oh, we lost you there.
You muted, Professor. You accidentally muted yourself.
I'm so sorry. Thank you so much, Professor Luesebrink, for this fascinating talk in such a smooth and calm manner. And you have sort of, highlighted almost all the major aspects of electronic literature and also the challenges that electronic literature faces today. You pointed out some very important aspects. For example, when you said electronic literature, especially the kind of literature that we see in the form of fan fiction or flash fiction, etc., it's a social change in action. I think that's a very pertinent point that we need to think about. We don't consider, we don't take this literature very seriously. We don't really attach meaning to it very often. So I think it's a very important aspect that you pointed out. You also mentioned the ephemeral aspect of electronic literature. Whenever one thinks of preserving something, we say digitize it, and one tends to assume that everything that becomes digital from print goes digital from print will be preserved for a longer period. But as you pointed out, it is also ephemeral because softwares become outdated, and so that is something that the writers who are doing digitally born literature have to confront. So, but the good thing is that it is global right from its inception. So that is an added advantage that writers of electronic literature have. Then you also mentioned something again very important, which is that the process of creation of electronic literature exposes us to the architectonics of knowledge, where information is and how it is to be tabbed and in what kind of forms it exists on the web. And you mentioned the importance of curating electronic literature. I think these are the points on which we all need to think and apply our mind, and perhaps take electronic literature as somebody mentioned yesterday, that first step would be to accept electronic literature as literature and to take it seriously, to recognize it. I think it needs recognition. A lot of times in departments of literature, electronic literature is dismissed, as something trivial, as something frivolous. With these insights, I think we can go to the questions, and I would invite the rapporteur to take up questions from the chat box. And maybe I can begin with a question from my side, which you can answer, and then after that, the rapporteurs can read out questions from the chat box.
Do the chat? Do I have to read it?
Somebody will read it for you.
Thank
Yeah, I was wondering how electronic literature transforms our definition of literature. What is literary? We in traditional departments of literature, we have been used to a certain understanding of literature and literariness. So once we shift from this print literature to electronic literature or digitally born literature, how that understanding of literariness gets transformed. Maybe you can share your thoughts because you are a practitioner.
Well, thank you so much for asking that, because I think it's an important thing to make a distinction about. There are really two different ways of looking at this, at the issue of how literature relates to its electronic form. On the one hand, there is a simple practicality, which is no matter where you are today, anything which gets printed is first in electronic form, because all the printing and all the processing of print literature happens nowadays electronically, and then it has an output as print. And so, of course, we can think of the fact that even as stone is always stone and vellum would always be vellum, nowadays, everything which we would think of as print information is that gets finally printed out on paper exists in an electronic form as it's being assembled. So really, the idea that somehow or other, unless you're reading someone's private diary or they wrote their book themselves and there are only a few copies, if it's in mass printing and you're buying it somewhere, it was in electronic form. So the issue of what it is that print is or information is has already been mooted to the issue of it doesn't have to be in print to exist, because if it once existed as a novel in electronic form as they were getting ready to print it, that doesn't erase the fact that it's literature. On the second hand is a whole artistic way of looking at what is literature. And I think, of course, that in all cultures, we have pre-existing literature before we had print. And sometimes it's in a parchment, sometimes it's in a roll. Many times it exists on the walls of buildings in which we have narrative panels that tell a story. This is definitely true in so many Indian architectural beauties, and many other cultures have that kind of storytelling all the way across the world. Now, was that literature? In most expansive views by most people, it would be yes. And so what we see is that literature is less an issue of what the medium of production is, and much more an issue of what the intent is. Now, of course, you can ask the question, is it literature if somebody writes a poem on Instagram? And I would say that if we follow our model, which is that the output is not the indicator of what it is, but rather the intention of the communication, then all of this is definitely literature in the sense that we would want to expand that definition.
Right, thank you. Now our rapporteur will read out questions from the chat box and you can answer that. So, Fajal?
Good morning, everyone. I am Farhana, and I will be taking on the question and answer session. Thank you, Professor Marjorie, for the insightful lecture. So with everyone's permission, I would like to move on to the question and answer session. We have a question from Radhika Ramesh. She asks, what is your advice to research scholars of electronic literature, and are digital and electronic synonymous?
Oh, well, the advice is pretty broad. Is there Nadia, would you like to narrow that a little to what advice for future, or can we get a input on that? Am I getting anything, Eric?
Oh, she might be on mute.
She might be on mute. I'm not hearing you.
No, sorry, ma'am. So the question goes, what is your advice to research scholars of electronic literature, and are digital and electronic synonymous?
Digital and electronic synonyms? New scholars that are entering into the digital electronic literature form have a an exciting prospect ahead. There's much to look at. And I would have 3 pieces of advice for a new scholar entering the field. The first piece of advice would be to actually, and this is rather fun advice, I would say if you're newly entering into a scholarly field like electronic literature, look around and follow the things that you like. There are an enormous amount of interesting approaches to sharing information, images, ideas. You should open yourself up to as many as possible before you will, as you will need to, narrow down. The second thing I would say is that it's important for people who are entering the scholarly fields in electronic literature to actually try it, to do something, to practice it. You don't have to become an artist or a practitioner, but you should try to actually do something, even if it's writing an Instagram poem or a flash piece of fiction on Facebook. You learn so much by doing in this particular field. And the third thing I would say is that this is a wide open field. Electronic literature is still in its infancy. It is the future of literature worldwide. And I think especially in the sense of the economies of communication, we all want to be connected. And this is the way that we can do it in the most direct and satisfying way in it with our technology today.
Thank you, ma'am. I will move on to the next question.
Okay.
Yeah. So we have someone asking, your insights about accessibility of knowledge in the domain of e-literature are remarkable. Please share some insights about far-reaching implications of this phenomenon, specifically on societies or communities which are culturally and ethnically complex and diverse.
The issue of complex societies with much diversity and in a sense complexity that derives from that is an important issue in terms of the access to knowledge and the access to really all forms of electronic communication, but especially electronic literature, which often is less easy to access if you don't know where you're going or how to look for it. I would say that we have many ways of entering into this that schools, universities, students, and professors and teachers can make public, can make available to the community. We have, for example, in electronic literature, ELO has created 4 electronic literature collections. These are extensive, having dozens of works in each one of them over the last 20 years. They cover almost the entire world. There are many things that are in the native language or in some kind of translation. All you have to do is go online and look at the possibilities and click on something and click around until you find it. We also have interesting things for people who are going into the field in terms of collections like ELMSIP, and you can find these on the electronic literature organization, eliterature.org, ELMSIP, the electronic literature directory, and other scholarly and annotated collections of works, authors, and projects. So we are doing everything we can, I think, to try to make the structure of the knowledge of electronic literature as available as possible to as many communities as we can.
Okay, ma'am, there's a second part to this question. Should I proceed?
Sure.
Anna,
Okay.
since we are short of time, why don't you read all the questions together and then Professor Marjorie can respond to them?
Okay, ma'am, sure.
Do what?
And she's gonna read you a series
Okay.
of questions.
So the second part to this question was, could you also reflect on the future possibilities of radical social changes in the times of growing surveillance? Should I move on to the next one, ma'am?
Would you, how much time do we have left? And should I answer only one of the questions?
Yes, ma'am,
Maybe,
whatever you want.
Professor Marjorie, maybe she will read out all the questions and then you can club the answers together. Would that be fine?
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you. I will do that.
Should I repeat this question, ma'am?
You can go on. I'll hang that. I've got that one.
Okay, ma'am. So we have one.
She muted again.
Yeah,
You're muted again. You're muted
Sorry,
again.
ma'am, I'm extremely sorry. So we have, how does e-literature possess a threat to earlier published works? Kindly elaborate.
Yeah, next.
Yes, ma'am, that would be all. Thank you.
That's all? Okay,
Yes.
so we have two issues here coming up that I think are really important. And I'd like to actually reverse them in order. The first one was the second question that you asked, which is, how does e-literature pose a threat to print literature publication? And the second would be, how are we thinking, or what is our attitude, or how do we comprehend our possibilities in a world in which social change is everywhere under surveillance and possible threat to individuals who are participating in the social change? So back to the first one, I believe that the issue of what was the relationship, or was there a competition between electronic literature and print literature, was acute in the 1990s and maybe even early 2000s. But I think that the outcome has been pretty much established, and that has shown that there's a growing audience for what we would consider essentially print literature, and that growing audience actually is extending to things like Kindle books and Audible books, in which people are getting the delivery of the printed book in an electronic form, but are finding that, let's say, if they have vision problems, or they don't have a lot of space to store physical books, they can participate in a wide variety of genres and read whatever they want. So I don't think that electronic literature, which we would consider digital born, with images, structure, sound, animation, video, multimedia narrations, I don't think that those pose a threat at all. They simply complement each other and are different ways that we can receive literature. The second issue, which is the issue of how social change might affect us, or we might affect social change, I think varies very much from culture to culture. And I also think that we don't really know what our relationship is to the surveillance that might be out there. And I wouldn't say that that would be any different in India or China or the United States of America or Canada or Costa Rica. I believe that we do not yet quite understand what the relationship is between our electronic media and the amount of surveillance that is possible to exert there. Obviously, that's going on as an argument right now on Twitter and on other social media platforms, where the question is how much censorship should there be? I myself, as a person and as an artist, I feel that it's important to do as much as you can that you feel is your truth. But I also think that it's important to be aware of what the risks are that you might be taking. That would be my answer to that.
Thank you, ma'am, for the enlightening answers. With that, we come to the end of our question and answer session.
Thank you, Farhana, for your help. And thank you, Professor Marjorie, for this absolutely brilliant session, which has left us with so much of food for thought right in the morning. It was really a pleasure to have you. And on behalf of my department, on behalf of my brilliant organizer, Dr. Shimi Monidole, and my head, Professor Simi Malhotra, I express my gratitude to you for joining us, and hopefully we'll be able to connect with you in future also. And it was a pleasure to have you, Dini, also. Hopefully we'll have more opportunities to connect with both of you in future. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. It was a lovely session to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Marjorie, for a very lucid, talk. It has really, inspired, aroused more interest in those people who were here just to being an audience, and for our department as well. I feel it an honor to have you, talk about e-literature, give your, speech as a plenary speaker here. And I see that a lot of people have joined it because of that. Thank you so much. And thank you, Denny, for, joining in, in the future, we also plan to have you as well, have you as a speaker in the future.
Well, I hope that you will keep in touch with me and let me know what you're doing.
Yes,
I spent some time, looking at the university and looking at your developments and so forth. And it's just a fascinating thing that you're, moving forward, and you have so many wonderful panels, and it's very impressive. So I really don't want to lose touch, and I want to, keep up with what you're doing and the developments. So will you stay in touch with me about that?
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you so much for contacting me and for allowing me to
And
share.
we have, Samya. He's also been a very, very, helpful, hand in, guiding me. He's a young research scholar. And these are the, people who are the so-called, I won't say the pioneers, but these people who are arousing a lot of interest in this field in India. Samya Brother Roy. He's a research scholar in IIT Jodhpur. Jodhpur, na, Samya?
What did you say?
Jump for another person.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, for letting me. Let us email. Can you email me all that you're saying, so that I can not note down the names and so forth?
Yeah, of course. I have to, write a mail to all the speakers. Well, a thank you note for being, in the pleasure, the honor of, hosting you people.
Yes, I'd love to. I'd like to know all the people that got together and did this, and I'd like to stay in touch with all of you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Somyo can also help. He is the founder of the Elit India, Association India. Yeah, Elit India ka. He's also, I think, a member of ELO. I'm sure.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, definitely.
Okay. Thank you once again. Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Deni. And
Thank you.
I think you can now move on to the next session.
Okay, I'll go to the next session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.